Hi there. There are a few general trends that we can see on the Western left overall that are either incorrect or worrying if not corrected. For clarity's sake, a lot of this is present on the online left, and that doesn't necessarily reflect on actual organizations and their positions. Regardless, these positions are coming from somewhere, and the people that promote them have decently sized platforms that can influence otherwise impressionable people new to the left. This in turn can influence organizations, which can result in mistakes that otherwise could be avoided. Critiquing is always good, when well-targeted, well-intentioned, nuanced, and educated. With that said, let's start. Reformism and Social-Democracy. One of the most common and most dangerous errors of the Western left that I see is an undue obsession with solely reformism and the promotion of social democracy. Without having undergone a proper study on what essentially funds social democracy, we end up with those that simply desire a kinder capitalism, whether intentionally or by ignorance. That, however, doesn't stop the Social Democrats and the so-called democratic socialists from fighting for more of a welfare state in, say, the US. Now, it's not a bad thing per se that there is a fight for more of a social democratic order in the US, for Americans, that is. The thing is, and for whatever reason this is rarely touched upon by the more radical sections of the left in the West, is that welfare states aren't built on the sweat of their own people. In order for there to be a reduction of misery at home, there needs to be an export of misery abroad. The only way, and the way all the traditional social democracies of Europe have done it, of developing their welfare programs is off the backs of neocolonialism and imperialism. Things like colonial taxes, for example in France's case, unequal exchange and value transference, or the exploitation of different ethnic sections of the population directly, like in apartheid South Africa, or arguably within the US today. Some of you have thought to yourselves by now, maybe there's a material basis, a material reason for why certain sections of the Western left decide to fight for solely social democracy, and you'd be right in thinking in that direction. Why do they fight so strongly for a kinder capitalism? Why do they prefer social democracy over revolution and the overthrow of capitalism? I have already touched on this in another video, which you can watch here. With social democracy analyzed, what about reformism and electoralism? Now let's define our terms. Electoralism is the idea that we can instigate social and political change that would benefit the working class, that being the vast majority of the population, through elections. We need to make something abundantly clear. The ruling class has set up a system that works for them. The ruling class doesn't lose elections that they pay for. Liberal democracies are what Marx called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, meaning even though you can go every few years to some booth, your influence is practically nil. It is in essence their dictatorship, regardless of all the propagandizing over how democratic these countries are. Ruling class interests prevail, their policies get passed. That's why tax cuts for the rich happen at the same time as the biggest cuts to healthcare, education, and pensions. If we truly lived in a democracy, the mass of people, whom vastly outnumber the ruling class, would logically get their demands met via the vote, their demands being simple. Generally, no one's really against free education, no one's against decent pensions for the old. Yet those are taken away while the ruling class dodges taxes without even so much as a slap on the wrist. The system is set up for them, not us. This is why redistribution of wealth is only seen as a bad thing when the suggestion is that the money goes from the rich to the poor. The thing is, we already have redistribution of wealth. It's just from the bottom up rather than the other way around. Electoralism fails exactly because of this. It's a rigged game from the very start. The ruling class owns the TV stations, the newspapers, and every other means of mass communication. The ruling class has virtually unending supplies of money for election campaigns, advertisement, and promotion for their puppets they run in order to further bolster their interests. If you're a progressive candidate, you don't even need to have particularly radical demands for them to smear you into the ground. Just look at what they did to Corbyn or Bernie Sanders. Forget about just running in elections. Suppose you do win. Suppose you brave the odds, and against all the smears and lies, against all the money they give to your opponents, against every single difficulty, you win. You abide by all the rules they set up and win. Do they just give up? Do they concede their defeat and let you have this one? No, of course not. This has happened before, many times in fact. Two examples come to mind. Salvador Allende in Chile, nearly 50 years ago now, and Evo Morales in Bolivia, just this past little while. If you're unfamiliar with how they both ended, the ruling class sooner supported fascist movements to retain their power than to concede defeat and give the minutest concessions to the working class. Allende was overthrown with the blessings of the CIA by the fascist Pinochet, and Morales was overthrown by the Bolivian military, again with the blessings of the CIA. They sooner arm fascist gangs and murder working class people than relinquish even the smallest amount of their wealth. Only when the Bolivian people armed themselves and fought tooth and nail for their gains was it possible for Morales to return. Allende was not so lucky, though, and died fighting. This is our supposedly inviolable democracy. This is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So, what is to be done? Does that mean we should just roll over and take it? Of course not. We just need a change of tactics. We need to remember that electoral politics aren't fundamentally useless. There are two primary gains. The first being that if possible, we could win some small concessions for the working class, meaning for us. This should never be our sole goal because, as history has proven, concessions are always rolled back. That's why the NHS is being dismantled. That's why education that was free just a few decades ago is now hitting monopoly prices. The second, which is far more common and far more useful, is to show the rest of the non-class conscious population how useless electoralism can be. It acts as a black hole that sucks out the energy of the mobilized population once all they campaign for inevitably fails. Our mistake, then, is not to make use of the mass disappointment that follows these failures. In order to properly make use of all this energy, we need mass organizations that represent and reflect the interests of the working class. This could take the form of a vanguard party, for example, that being an organization of politically educated and motivated people that can disseminate radical, or not so radical ideas like, for example, how the ruling class will not let up on austerity unless we force their hand, something most people intuitively understand without having to read Lenin, for example. This is only one example, and my personal preference. It could be trade unions, it could be women's associations and student groups. Honestly, there are hundreds of examples throughout leftist history. In fact, diversity is our strength. As long as these groups are disciplined and work together, we can achieve something. In fact, we can achieve quite a lot. We shouldn't be so focused on working within the system. I'm not saying illegal methods per se. We could build preliminary forms of dual power, much like the Black Panthers attempted to do. We should fill and stretch all legal methods of organization as far as we can. In the end, though, part of being in the imperial core, where capitalism is most secure, means that eventually the organs of state repression will fall with full force, and illegal methods will suddenly become very attractive. The problem is, though, as history has shown, the chances of succeeding at attaining power in the imperial core are very slim. Why would we want to seize power, you ask? Well, unless we displace the power of the ruling class, of the bourgeoisie, and seize it ourselves, we'll never be able to establish true and permanent change. Positive change, that the vast majority of the population desires. So again, what is to be done? Here's where my personal opinion falls. Western leftists need to critically support progressive movements in the Third World, because their victories will weaken capitalism at home, shaking the power of our own ruling class and reducing the burden on those movements as well. This doesn't mean we ignore work in, for example, the UK, Germany, the US, or wherever else. This means that along with campaigning for more concessions from the ruling class, along with support for the homeless and those in severe poverty, along with attempts at building dual power at home, we also protest against economic sanctions and military attack against those progressive third world movements. Develop anti-war and anti-imperialist organizations in workplaces and schools and communities. Connect their struggle with the struggle at home. We not only should, but we need to do all we can to displace all that pressure from those progressive anti-capitalist movements to ensure their success. In this way, we can slowly break the weakest links in the chain of capitalism first, and with each link broken, we get closer to destroying the capitalist system entirely. In conclusion, read Lenin. Oof, it's a long video. Market socialism. A relatively new and worrying trend that can be seen on the Western left is that of market socialism. Now let me be very clear. The presence of markets in a country that is forced to adopt them out of necessity is one thing, and the belief that having markets as a final result is another. Examples of the first include, for example, Vietnam, while examples of the second include people with problematic and incomplete understandings of markets and their function. As Lenin remarked, markets at every turn reproduce capitalist relations every second of every day. The presence of markets grows petty bourgeois sentiment and ensures competition between enterprises. This means certain enterprises win out in the market and enlarge, while others lose out and have to be artificially kept afloat by the state. Since all enterprises are responsible for the well-being of their workers, meaning their wages and pension funds, parental leave, insurances, etc., in a cooperative system, if there's a failure in the market, it is these workers that feel the brunt of it. Something has to give. Either the enterprise fails and causes its workers to fall into poverty and unemployment, or the state steps up and artificially supports the enterprise despite its failure. What all this means, essentially, is that markets are instilled with a drive for inequality. If there are markets, there is competition. If there is competition, there are winners and losers. If there are losers, well, we just went over that. Yakovenko's work on econophysics has empirically demonstrated this, and is an incredibly interesting read. There are further consequences, though. As a result of bankrupt enterprises, you get unemployment and the formation of a reserve army of labor. This either is temporarily solved, again by state support, or by the migration of said workers to other countries as migrant workers. Those familiar with the history will recognize a striking parallel: Yugoslavia. The exact situation occurred in Yugoslavia, a famous example of an attempted cooperative market socialist economy, and required never-ending IMF loans to keep the situation up until the whole system just fell apart. Now, something can be said about limited markets for consumer goods, or a system of market socialism as a transitional measure, but you can check out Cockshot's video for further information. Two books that I'd recommend for further reading are Classical Econophysics and Against the Market: Political Economy, Market Socialism, and the Marxist Critique. Anti-Intellectualism. Something that you see all too frequently is biased sophistry that basically boils down to not wanting to actually educate oneself, not wanting to read the works, to study and learn from history and an established academic tradition. They disguise their neglect of studying by various ways. Why read works written by old dead white men from over 100 years ago? They couldn't possibly imagine modern conditions, they say, conveniently neglecting the rich tradition of non-white and non-male leftist traditions from Luxemburg to Fanon. Reading and study is anti-worker because... some crap justification that boils down to little more than insinuating that poor people are stupid and cannot possibly comprehend theory. If they're being generous, they might say poor people don't have the time. A very unmaterialist view, in reality. Ho Chi Minh noted that in his experience, illiterate Vietnamese peasants possess deeper understandings of Marxism based on their experience than the very educated ivory tower French Marxists he was used to dealing with in Paris. A more relevant example to Americans is that of the Black Panthers, whom would hold classes and reading groups where high school dropouts and those neglected by the American educational system would sit, dictionary in hand, to properly study and internalize Lenin and Mao's writings. I can reach correct conclusions by myself, which is the pinnacle of arrogance, and usually they never do. Whatever the reason, you're barring yourself from a century-old tradition with perspectives from some of the greatest minds to have ever existed. You can disagree with them, sure. You can even develop your own viewpoints, nobody's stopping you. But you have to first read their actual work before disagreeing. And no, reading a Wikipedia article isn't enough. The current state of things didn't fall from the sky. The political and historical changes that have occurred have reasons and underlying philosophies behind them. An analysis, even if written 100 years ago, can be very helpful and at least approaching an analysis of today. I believe these people are confused as to what theory is and its primary purpose. It isn't a bunch of religious texts, and they aren't blueprints for revolution, or whatever else. You can 100% disagree. You can have completely opposite opinions, but you cannot honestly claim your opinions to be informed if you haven't even bothered to see what incredibly complex conversations took place between people much smarter than you and I. You cannot have an informed opinion on imperialism, for example, without reading the relevant works. Lenin's Imperialism, John Smith's work, Emmanuel Arguyri, Samir Amin, the concepts of value chains and unequal exchange, etc. You cannot have an informed opinion on the Reformism versus Revolution conversation if you haven't read Luxemburg's work, if you haven't read the exchanges between Lenin and Kautsky. A lot of theory can be out of date, I agree, but a lot is also incredibly pertinent to this very day. Not only this, but a lot of relevant theory is still being written, with half the works I mentioned being published in the past 15 years. I'm not saying theory is a concrete science. What I'm saying is that, like reading about literally anything else, you can avoid common pitfalls and dead ends others encountered. More information and education is never a bad thing. Internalize this. Breadtube. Now, this is a viewpoint that thankfully is becoming more common, but the phenomenon of Breadtube is, well, very meh. This isn't really a denunciation of the whole endeavor, but more of a cursory glance at it. They've done some good, but the entire experience has permeated such large swaths of the online left that it should be discussed and rightfully critiqued. It's painted as a space for increasing socialist rhetoric and for countering the right. But anyone looking at it from afar sees it's mostly about individual branding and popularity and clout. Now, this is present in pretty much all media, and politics is no different. The point I'm bringing across is that for Breadtube, this is a defining feature. Again, Breadtube has done some good, but the issues should be highlighted. There is, for example, a very strong American bias, for one. The casual censorship on the subreddit for more radical voices, or explicitly Marxist voices in some instances too. The default position on foreign policy usually not being all that much better than what the US State Department says. There are other examples. Otherwise, I'm not the only one that's noticed that it's kind of an echo chamber for mostly white upper middle class voices to discuss topics that they can't really be pushed too hard on. You notice it in the popular politics of Breadtube. The most radical I've seen is lukewarm left-liberal talking points around the Democrats or other intra-electoral discussion. They mostly center in on social issues and media analysis. These are both safe and entertaining products, not mediums used to inform or raise the cultural and political level of people. Talking about why, for example, the show Sherlock sucks, or mental health, or even, God forbid, those awful Harry Potter books is all good, but where is the radicalism here, exactly? Some talk about the culture war, but I fail to see how liberal talking points with only the most casual criticism of capitalism can really change people's minds all that much. Some talk about incremental change, but if we're really going to play this domino by domino game, the world will be in flames due to climate change before we'll be even halfway to class consciousness. The creation of personas to be consumed and followed, styles meant to be more eye-catching than informative, the seemingly all-too-common phenomenon of once said Breadtuber becomes relatively successful, they immediately shed their former radical beliefs for safe, Democrat-adjacent talk. It's all cliché at this point. It's just a different way of commodifying the YouTuber aesthetic and giving it a red, or more appropriately pink, coat of paint. The internet is no longer the domain of those that only have money. In vast swaths of the world, you can reach all sorts of people through the internet, so you can't meme, oh, the internet is only for rich white people, so you're not doing anything inherently revolutionary, no matter what you say. 100 years ago, it was newspapers that reached those that we want to get our message across to. Sadly, the internet, with all its vast capacities, hasn't been as diligently used for the same aim as we'd hope. A few videos that I can recommend on this topic are Yugopnik's fantastic video on consumerism as activism, and Dan Torres' video on LeftTube, which you can find here. Breadtube is a decent first introduction, but only that. What's my solution? More talk on concrete political action, more education, more encouragement to read and do research, more talk of revolution, and, of course, more diversity. But others have said this much better than I have. I think that's enough for today. This is nothing more than just a casual glance at only some issues the Western left may have. The list can be much, much longer, and the analysis much, much deeper. I hope it gave you some food for thought, at least.